Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Explainer. Today we're diving into the theology and history behind a really specific, ancient practice, the Catholic obligation to attend Sunday Mass. You know, whether you grew up Catholic, or maybe you're just looking at this from the outside, or even if you're just curious about how these ancient structures fit into our modern world, we're going to unpack exactly why this is considered such a serious, absolute commitment.
To kick things off, let's look at this really relatable conversation from our source material between a young Catholic and his grandfather. The grandson basically asks, "Hey, I pray every day. Isn't that enough? Do I really have to go to Mass every single Sunday?" It's such a great way to frame this, right? Because it hits the nail on the head regarding modern religious practice. We live in an incredibly individualized era, so it's totally natural to wonder why a scheduled, communal gathering is considered absolutely mandatory.
Okay, let's dive into this. That brings us to our central question for today. Is this requirement just some bureaucratic church rule made up over the centuries? Or, according to the teachings, does it actually come from God himself? Let's find out.
Here's our roadmap for the Explainer. First, is personal prayer enough? 2, the Lord's Day explained. 3, more than just prayer. 4, church authority and obligation. 5, the cost of missing Mass. And finally, heaven touching earth. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. Is personal prayer enough? The invitation to the table. Well, going back to that grandfather's wise reply, he points out that while yes, prayer is absolutely essential, Jesus actually invites us to his table.
Section 2. The Lord's Day explained, tracing the biblical foundation. Let's explore why Sunday isn't just another day of the week in this tradition.
If we trace this chronologically, the obligation actually builds over centuries. It all starts way back in the Old Testament, in Exodus 20, with the Third Commandment telling the faithful to keep the Lord's Day holy. But then, there's a massive shift. As recorded in Luke 24, Sunday is the exact day Jesus Christ is said to have risen from the dead. And because of that monumental, history-altering event, Acts 20 shows us that from the absolute earliest days of Christianity, believers actively shifted their gatherings to Sunday to celebrate the Eucharist. So this obligation, it's built directly on this chronological, biblical progression.
Moving right along to Section 3, more than just prayer, the core difference. Now, what's really interesting here is how the source tackles that modern objection we mentioned earlier, can't I just pray at home? Look at this contrast. On one side, personal private prayer is seen as essential, it's super important, but on its own, it's considered incomplete. On the other side, the holy sacrifice of the Mass is presented as the absolute highest act of worship. At Mass, believers aren't just talking to God. They hear His word, they unite to Christ's sacrifice, and they receive the Eucharist. As we mentioned with that grandfather's analogy, it's literally viewed as an invitation to a table. Private prayer, as great as it is, just cannot replace those tangible elements.
Section 4. Church authority and obligation, guiding the faithful. So how does the church enforce this?
According to the source, the whole basis for this mandate rests on the belief that Jesus explicitly entrusted his church with the authority to guide his faithful. Because Sunday Mass is viewed as so fundamentally essential, the church requires it. And they're clear that it's not just to, boost weekly attendance numbers. It's because Jesus actually desires his people to gather around his altar.
Section 5. The cost of missing Mass. Understanding the stakes. Let's impartially break down the specific theology here. So, the crucial point is this heavy theological term, grave matter. Now, I know that sounds like medieval legal jargon, but it has a highly specific meaning in this context. The source states that when a Catholic freely and knowingly chooses to miss Sunday Mass without a serious reason, they are deliberately rejecting the worship and communion God lovingly invites them to share. And this choice, it's considered a direct, deliberate harm to a person's relationship with God. But, and this is absolutely key, the source frames this obligation not as some heavy burden designed to weigh people down, but rather as a spiritual guardrail. It's meant to keep people close to Christ. It isn't a rigid punishment, it's a relational necessity.
And to prove this isn't just an unreasonable burden, the church provides very specific, valid exceptions. You aren't bound by this obligation if you're prevented by a serious reason, things like an illness, or if you're caring for someone who is sick, or another genuinely grave circumstance. This shows there's built-in pastoral care and common sense for folks who literally, physically cannot attend. Finally, Section 6, Heaven Touching Earth, the Source and Summit. Let's summarize how the source material views the Mass.
And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate conclusion. Sunday Mass is considered the space where heaven actually touches earth through the whole Eucharist. It's the fulfillment of the Lord's Day. The obligation exists simply because God desires faithful participation. It's supposed to be a loving, active response to a divine invitation, not just marking your name on an attendance sheet.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly thought-provoking question from the source material. If the creator of the universe invited you to his table, how would you RSVP? It completely flips the script, right? It changes the perspective from following a rule out of fear to responding to a deeply personal invitation. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. Keep curious, and we'll see you next time.